Um, Welcome to the Creative Kimchi Summer Ferment class. Our mission at Farm Table is to build local food culture through education, training, and research. And we talk about our 4 C's of building community, supporting conservation, teaching the crafts around local food, which of course is partly what we're doing tonight. And then the 4th C of the building local food culture, a place that would support the local economy through supporting local farmers, through supporting the rich, healthy soils, and so on. So Sylvia is our board chair, actually, and also has done a lot of teaching for us lately. Baking, our first sourdough baking class after COVID-19 hit had 175 people sign up for it. As many of you know, the folks were like, what do I do now? And what if bread runs short or something? So there's no yeast. So it's been a very interesting time for us. I'm really grateful for your participation with us as we've adjusted to online classes. And obviously we'll be joining Sylvia in her kitchen. Sylvia is a grass-fed beef farmer, a radio host, has years in the sort of media world, and she can introduce herself further if she wishes. She's also on the board of MOSES, the Midwestern Organic Sustainable Education Society. So very involved in the local food movement in the Amory area, Wisconsin area. So thanks for joining us, Sylvia, and just jump right in. And folks, the other thing to say is if you want to ask a question, there's that chat box in your middle of your screen. Please just go ahead and send a chat message in and I will convey that to Sylvia. Sylvia will stop periodically and we'll see if there are questions and we'll handle those that way. So thanks for joining us. Sylvia, take it away. Thank you.
Thanks an awful lot, Mike. And it is so much fun to have people at my farm kitchen once again in a Zoom class, this time around midsummer fermentation. Now, a question out to you right off the bat. How many of you have fermented vegetables in the past? Or have fermented anything? Kombucha, kefir, yogurt? Raise your hand and maybe let me know what it is that you made. I'd love to see that.
And you can type those in the chat box. Joy says never.
All right.
Dorothy says she has done some.
Good, good. Well, we're all going to start from where we are, and it's going to be fun. I'd also like to know if you would take a moment to just type in what city and state you're zooming in from, because that's always a fun thing to learn as we start these classes.
St. Paul, Minnesota, Raleigh, North Carolina, Amory, Minneapolis. A couple of people have said they've now typed in, one person tried kombucha and fermented veggies. Dorothy said one bad attempt at cabbage and successful yogurt. So.
Okay, good for you. That's really good to see. And all right, well, as we get started here, I'm going to show you what I picked from my kitchen garden just before this class started. Really big bouquet of basil and a number of sprigs of cilantro. And you can see the size of this grouping of stems. And I want you to note just how much I've got here, because we're going to use this beautiful and really fragrant herb collection for one of the ferments as we go through our class today. All right, but before we actually get to the demonstration, I'd like to kind of move us quickly to a slideshow. It's really short. It's not going to be anything really long about fermentation, because some of you have said you've never done it. Some of you have done it very successfully with a certain type. Others have had success here, a failure there, which I've certainly experienced too. So let's get to this slideshow class. It's a pretty neat thing that we're all together. We can be all together thanks to technology. All right, so here we are in the summer, and many of us tend to think about vegetable fermentation as the summer ends and fall begins, when we start collecting cabbages and cauliflower and Brussels sprouts, and mature onions. But there is stuff that we can do just as our gardens begin to come into full flush. And in fact, I don't know if you're like me, but when I go to my garden and I see myself there in July, the seedlings have come up, they're 3 or 4 inches high, and they're crowded. And I think, oh no, I have to pull some of these out and waste that little seedling. I really hate to do it, but you know, it's got to be done so that the rest of the plants can grow and mature to be big and productive plants. So here's a way of doing midsummer, both creative kimchis and salads that make use of seedlings, those little out of the garden, your herbs as they come into flush, and other produce as it's even really still small, but can be pulled at this time. So what is fermentation? Well, some of you have already said that you do some of it, but one of the things I really like about fermenting, whether it's vegetables or yogurt, kombucha or kefir, is that it's low tech. You really don't need a lot of very expensive or complicated equipment to use it. Fermentation has been around for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years in every corner of the globe. Some cultures ferment meats and fish, others all kinds of grain, dairy, tubers. There's almost no kind that can be fermented, and it's happening for hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of years worldwide. Fermentation is a controlled transformation of food. So we're actually going to use a bit of skill and take a look at some indicators so that we can get to where we want to go with this process, so that it changes flavor. It does increase the nutritional availability of that food, and it extends the life or shelf life of a food by preserving it. So before that, there was freezing, which is a very new technology, and before there was canning, which only happened in the mid-1800s, there was fermentation. That's how we got preserved milk into cheese, various grains in beer, grapes into wine. It is that for the purposes of today's class anyway, is anaerobic, which means it operates, it works absent oxygen and air. Now, if you ever made kombucha, if you've ever made yogurt, you know that you can have a jar that's open to the elements. You can do that very easily, but that's not the case in the fermentation that we're talking about. We're talking about lacto fermentation, also known as lactic acid fermentation, and an activity that promotes beneficial bacteria to such an extent that your food product becomes acidic, and the environment that your food is in becomes really hostile to bad bacteria and only is helpful and fosters the activity of healthful bacteria. And I think you may have noticed that the very last bullet on that screen said, it is a process that is activated through salt, not vinegar. We are not talking about any kind of pickling that uses vinegar. Okay, so fermentation includes wild fermentation, which makes use of the bacteria that's normally on food, the raw food that you pull out of the garden or that you buy at the farmer's market or get in your CSA box. And it also includes a subset called cultured food. If you've ever made kombucha and yogurt, you know that you use a really specific set of bacteria and yeast combinations in order to produce things like sourdough, yogurt, kombucha, kefir. It's using a specific subset of bacteria to make those foods. We are talking about wild fermentation, the one that makes use of the bacteria and the various kinds of microbes that exist when you pull a fruit or vegetable right out of the ground. Okay, so the benefits of fermentation, whether it's a really long fermentation or a shorter one, and we'll talk a little bit about that, is, and you've heard these terms before, fermented products are good because they contain probiotics. And probiotics are good for the digestive system. And what a probiotic is, it's foods that have been partially pre-digested by the microbes in your fermentation jar. When your microbes work on the food, it actually makes more vitamins, minerals available for our gut to consume. Fermentation also has live cultures, and those also promote the microbial diversity of our intestinal system. Not because those are going to live in us, but they actually add and they help the cultures that already exist in us. Now, when you ferment something, you can also neutralize harmful enzymes and toxic compounds. For example, that tuber, known as the cassava or manioc, contains cyanide. And in order for it to be consumed safely, it's cut up, soaked in water for days and days, which begins the fermentation process, and the cyanide is nullified. It's also really important, this whole idea of fermentation and soaking is also really important when you think about nuts and seeds and legumes, beans, because those particular kinds of foods contain phytates. And phytates are, some people call them anti-nutrients. Those phytates make it really difficult for us to absorb the really good nutrients that might be in a bean or in a seed or in a raw whole grain. In other words, if you and I go to buy whole grain bread, which is available everywhere now, if that grain has not been either soaked, sprouted, or fermented in some fashion, you are not getting the full advantage of that grain because the phytates will make it difficult or impossible for you to absorb the nutrition within that bread. Amazing. And so that's why one of the things that you might hear from people who are involved in traditional cooking is that they soak their grains, they soak their beans, they soak their seeds in an effort to nullify or combat those phytates and make more of the nutrition within that grain, as well as in the other foods that that grain is mixed into, make it more available, more bioavailable. And of course, that gets to that last bullet, which is when you ferment something, you increase the availability of vitamins and minerals, including a whole range of B vitamins that are not available when you do not ferment foods. And this is not old wives' tales, if you want to call it that. This is not just rumor. These kinds of benefits have been researched and validated. All right, so the fermentation process goes through 3 stages. And this is one of the important things that we need to keep in mind as we think about quick ferments and fast acting salads. Because they are quick, they're going to be limited in some fashion. But let's go through those 3 stages. And each stage builds on the environment that has been created within the jar so that it builds the nutrition and also the ability to extend the life of that ferment. For example, in stage 1, most of us have done this. If you've done any kind of fermenting at all, you chop up your veggies, you add your salt, and either it's in a brine or you dry salt something and you let it sit. And you jar it, you put it in a jar. And this first stage lasts about 5 days. Now, as you might imagine. You put chopped up cabbage. That's what you're looking at right there, chopped up cabbage. If you put salted, chopped up cabbage in a jar and you press it down into the jar so that you exclude as much air bubbles as possible, and you even put it into an environment where you're trying to really exclude oxygen and air, there's still some oxygen in that mix. And the bacteria that are within that mix in the first 5 days are taking advantage of that oxygen and actually consuming it, thereby yielding an environment within that jar that is becoming oxygen free. In stage 2, which begins roughly day 5 to day 7 of that fermentation, you get a whole different set of bacteria in that jar. It's shifted because now you have an environment that doesn't have that oxygen in it. And these bacteria are tolerant to both salt and acid. And it supports only those microbes that can exist in that salty, acidy environment. And those microbes, as you can see here in the slide, produce lactic acid, acetic acid, ethanol, carbon dioxide, along with glycerol. And this is part of the evolution of this, or succession of bacteria through this jar. And this is when you get a lot of those bubbles rising to the surface in your fermentation. It's an exciting thing to watch. I know I do. I love to see the bubbles coming up in a ferment. It's telling me it's working, and those bubbles are the carbon dioxide that are produced. Then stage 3. And stage 3 begins on day 10 or 12 into the fermentation process. By this time, the community of bacteria has shifted again, so that most of the bacteria are now lactobacillus, which produce lactic acid. Lactic acid, which is salt and acid, or rather these species are salt and acid tolerant. Again, this has become an environment that only is good for the good bacteria and really discourages other kinds of bacteria or microbes that would spoil your food. And it is this concentration now, as you go into stage 3 and beyond, that extends the life of that ferment so that actually it can be stored months. As you can see in the last point, and something that I put on a website by a microbiologist, is that it's good for this last stage to stay active about 2 weeks in order to yield a safe pH. But once you've completed your 3, 4, 5 weeks of fermentation, that ferment can now be put into your fridge and stored there for months at a time. All right, but we're talking about quick ferments. We're not talking about something that's 4 or 5 weeks in the making. What are these and what are their benefits? Well, they provide a burst of flavor, but they only progress through that first stage of fermentation. Well, that means some activity actually was done. So don't worry about that. There is some benefit, but they are quick to make. And because they haven't gone through that really end stage, stages 2 and 3, quick ferments and salads are to be consumed quickly in less than a week. So as we're making either short-term or long-term ferments, what's some of the basic equipment? It's stuff that you've already got in your kitchen, to be honest. You've got jars. Now, they may not be canning jars, but you might have jars that are from other kinds of foods that you've purchased. What you want to make sure you've got is a jar with a tight-fitting lid. I happen to use digital scales all the time because when you, and especially when you bake, which is something that I do a lot of, the digital scale gives you exact measurements. And And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Measuring spoons will be useful too. Large and medium bowls. You can read that list. And then this thing called weights. We'll get into that a little bit. It's something to weigh down your vegetables once they're in the jar. And if you're going to be dealing with hot peppers, you may want disposable gloves because, man, I don't know about you, but I've gotten hot peppers sometimes in a cut, and that is no fun. Some basic ingredients. Well, the veggie of your choice. Salt, and sea salt is preferred. That it's not that kosher, and we'll talk a little bit about the difference between a sea salt and a kosher salt. And I guess I really do counsel against table salt because sometimes it has additives and preservatives in it that might actually hinder your fermentation. So just something to think about. Of course, if you want to make boost the flavor of your ferment, you've got herbs. And those are just some of those that I just pulled out of my kitchen cabinet. They really add to the flavor of what you're doing. You see there, Korean pepper flakes. Those have become a staple in my kitchen. Not everybody's got them. I can understand that. So if you don't have Korean pepper flakes, think about any kind of red or green pepper flake that you have. And you may want to whiz them in a small grinder in order to get a slightly smaller size. Ginger, that boosts the flavor. Hot peppers, if you're using them, and fish sauce, which adds a level of flavor called umami, which is a real savory flavor, if you choose to. Okay, so what are the basic steps? You've got them right there. Not a heck of a whole lot. Just select your veggie, you slice it and dice it according to your recipe. Now this is the important part, adding the salt to your ferment. Why? Why salt? We'll go to that as we do the demo. You may want to mix a seasoning sauce or paste in order to really up the flavor of your ferment. You toss your veggies with the seasoning, you pack them into a jar tightly to promote a brine, the juices that come from that veggie and the salt that's been sprinkled on them. And you want that brine to come up so that it'll cover the veggies as much as possible. Now these are things that are now in the jar. What you then do is apply a follower. That's an interesting word used in fermenting. A follower just means a little cap of some sort that fits into the jar and rests against the vegetables themselves. It can be wax paper, it can be parchment paper, it can be a grape leaf, a cabbage leaf, then on top of the weight and a lid, because the purpose is to keep those veggies submerged. And then you let your ferment rest at room temperature as directed. Those are the basic steps in any kind of ferment. One of the things that makes life a little easier for us tonight is that some of the ferments that we're talking about ferment for such a short period of time that we don't have to be quite as critical about keeping the vegetable fully submerged. Because for some of these, you just make them and eat them immediately. All right. So here I've got a ferment that I made yesterday. It's actually a paste, but I want you to take a look at what happens when I use a cabbage press. This is what's used for making sauerkraut. When I use this on this vegetable, see what happens. Ooh. Let's go back. I think this thing didn't want to do the video. I wonder. There we go. I press down on this collection of veggies and a brine emerges under the pressure. Now, can anybody guess what I've got in this jar that's exuding so much juice? You can put your answer into the chat box. All right. So about quick fermented salads, once again, they provide a burst of flavor, but they only progress through that first stage of fermentation. They're quick to make, but they have to be consumed just as quickly, usually just a few days. All right. Well, before we get to the demo, I just thought I'd leave you with some of the books that I find I refer to again and again when it comes to making ferments. That top one called Fiery Ferment is just so much fun. It's how to make different kind of hot pastes and hot sauces, including one that's like a chocolate mocha habanero. It's like phenomenal. But these are some of the books I go to for reference. They take you all the way from how to do it to how to use it and incorporate it into your menus. And some of the websites that I find very, very useful include the website of the Weston A. Price Foundation, which is an organization that is dedicated to making more and more people aware of the benefits, the health benefits of cooking things traditionally, of sourcing food locally and organically. One of the things I really appreciate about the Weston A. Price Foundation is that their work, its work, is heavily researched. And they are dedicated to finding the research all around the world. So if you decide to become a member of that foundation, you will have access to unbelievable troves of scientific research. Then there's a website that many of you may know called Cultures for Health. They sell products. So they sell you the equipment that you might want. They sell you starter cultures. They also have recipes. And then Cultured Guru. This is a website by a microbiologist. Look at the behind the foods that a very, very interesting site.
A couple people entered an answer like spinach or collard or chard in terms of what you were answer to your question.
Yeah, good guesses. Really good. It was basil leaves. You know, we don't tend to think about basil as having an awful lot of juice in it. But once you start this process of adding a little bit of salt and massaging it, it is amazing what you get. And so for our purposes right now, we're going into the demo. I wanted to make two different kinds of ferments. I made them earlier in this week, and so they're sitting on my kitchen counter, but I thought we'd go through it right now. One of them has to do with radishes. So some of you may have radishes coming out of your ears in the garden, and you're wondering, what am I going to do with this? And you find radishes very plentiful at the farmers markets right now. Well, I've got a lot of radishes because I really like them. Lots of the time, usually raw. But I thought, why not a little radish salad? And so I picked some radishes from the garden. Here we got. So we've got French radishes, globe radishes, just plain old red radish. It's just a piece of garlic, a clove that I'll need in this recipe. And I picked the first of my purple top white globe turnips. And so I'm going to include this in here as well, because one of the things that's really neat about fermentation is that you can mix and match an awful lot. So what are the steps? Well, I'm going to go through it right now. And I think, Mike, I might need your help to make sure that I'm still within the screen so people can see what's going on. I'm taking this turnip and I am really coarsely peeling it with my large knife. And again, that knife, you know, was one of those basic ingredients. And you want it to be sharp. You want a sharp knife because you have to use less pressure with a sharp knife. You get lots more cuts in the kitchen when you use a dull knife. All right, I took off most of the peel, which is really tough on a turnip. And I've taken off, of course, the root end. I took off the top, not doing anything with those. Now, can you do anything with a radish top or a turnip top? Yes. You can actually ferment those as well as a green in the first, until it's about 2 inches high. After that, it just becomes very spiny and nothing that I'd want to really sink my teeth into. All right. So, ooh, nice. So I cut up this turnip, and now I'm going to, I cut it in half, and now I'm making kind of sticks with it. Slices, I'll show you. You can see the slice. It's not a very big turnip. You know, funny thing, whenever I start cutting up veggies, I think about my brother, my little brother, because he is a professional chef and a cooking school teacher in New York City. And he's got like amazing knife skills. I envy those. All right, so I cut up this turnip. And you've got this recipe in front of you too. And I'm just going to put the slices in here. And if I come across a piece that looks a little brown or damaged in some fashion, I toss it out. Okay, so here's this is a French breakfast radish. Some of you know those. They've got white bottoms and red tops. And I'm just cutting that in half, long ways. Here's my little radish. Cutting off the end, the root end. Cutting off anything that looks a little bit tough. Anybody actually doing anything along with me in this class? Anybody, any hands out there? Anybody have any questions right now?
Don't see any yet, Sylvia.
Okay. Okay.
Someone has asked if she can get the PowerPoint after, and we'll send that out, right? We can do that?
Yes. Yes. You know, one of the things that got me interested in these quick ferments is the fact that I had so much stuff in my garden that I needed to kind of weed. That was one thing. The other was, you know, you never know when you might want to go on a picnic and take something with you. Also, these kinds of quick ferments are really good with in a grain salad. Anybody make grain bowl salads? Kind of adding these to flavor it. I just discarded one of my radishes. A slug got to it. So I'm just continuing to cut these in half. All right. Almost done. I hope this is not boring for you, like watching paint dry. Yeah, it's funny. This is my go-to knife. I keep it sharp for every kind of use. And I think this knife cost me $6. at a Asian grocery store. One of the reasons why I like it is that you can sharpen it very effectively using a sharpening steel. Those of you who've made a ferment and it didn't turn out, what happened? What was it that you saw? I'd love to know what the problem was.
Sylvia, one woman wrote in and said it smelled and looked bad. It was red cabbage and turned black.
Ooh. Yes, I think you're right. It was bad. Red cabbage. Do you have any idea why that happened? Or how long into the process did you observe this? Radish.
She said maybe a month into the process.
A month. Wow. Maybe later in the class we can talk a little bit. I'd love to know what it was that you saw, because that might help me at some time too. It's always fun to kind of do these things together. All right, so I've cut up our radishes. I'm going to toss them with salt now. But the thing I've got to do is figure out, okay, how much do I have here in the way of weight? Because that's going to determine how much salt I use. So I've got my little digital scale, right? And I've got another glass bowl. Let's see. I'm weighing this. All right. I've got half a pound, 1/2 pound. So I've got 8 ounces. The recipe that you have is for 12 to 16 ounces. So I've got less. That's fine. There are only 2 of us in this household. And when you're making a quick kimchi or a quick salad, you don't necessarily want to make a lot, because you have to eat it fast. It's not like making a long-term kimchi where when you make it, you're going to be eating from the fridge for 9 months. This is something that has to be consumed quickly. So don't be afraid of cutting some of these recipes in half or by a third so that you can consume them quickly without you having a lot of waste. Okay, so I've got half a pound of radishes, and I'm going to toss them with salt. So how much salt should I use for 8 ounces? Let's see. I'm going to go with about a quarter tablespoon of sea salt. Okay, sea salt. Now you'll notice in your recipes that I quote both kosher salt and sea salt. And I would suspect that you know that a teaspoon of kosher salt is not the same as a teaspoon of sea salt, because the grains of kosher salt are so much bigger that they fill up the spoon before they've actually registered the same weight. That's why I tend to weigh my stuff. But for the purposes of today, we're going to be using a quarter tablespoon. Okay. There are 3 teaspoons in a tablespoon, and half, 1.5. A half tablespoon is 1.5 teaspoons, and I want half of that. So I need 3/4 of a teaspoon. Okay. So I'm going to take this salt and sprinkle it on. Why is it important to have enough salt? If you want to ferment safely, you need to use enough salt to get the job done. So if you're someone who is very conscious and apprehensive about salt, I can understand that. My response might be, eat less of this final food product so that you can control your salt intake. But if you don't use enough salt, especially in a very long fermentation process, you will not get the environment created that will only foster those really good bacteria. For example, I got a text from a friend the day before yesterday who said, this is for canning. She said, Sylvia, I canned a bunch of vegetables, I canned jalapeno jelly, and the jars sealed, but the jelly remained really liquid. What did I do wrong? And the thing that I advised her was, did you use enough sugar? Because sugar is not just a sweetener in jelly making, it also helps create the environment in order to gel. And she said, nope, I cut down on the sugar because I don't want to use so much sugar. I said, well, then you're not going to get jelly. So she went back, emptied out all the jars, redid the recipe, recanned them, and it came out fine because she increased the amount of sugar in the recipe. In fermentation, you need to have enough salt in order to help create that environment that you want that promotes the growth of good bacteria versus and combat the growth of others. So I've tossed this mixture with salt, and now the recipe says, and I hope you have that recipe in front of you, it says to let it rest. So we're going to let this rest. And as I was mixing it with the salt, it is already just, well, you probably can't see it here, but it's shimmering with the liquid that's already been exuded by the radishes. And when you think about a radish, you don't think about something that's got a lot of liquid in it, do you? But that's the activity of the salt. It pulls the liquid out while it adds to the rest of the fermentation process. So we're going to put these aside. And as I put that aside, I'm going to start on this next recipe. So this is actually a condiment that would actually be much more long lasting, but it also doesn't take very long to make. This condiment takes about 5 days to ferment. And it's made with herb leaves. So here's this big bouquet of basil. I just pulled it out of my garden, which is 10 feet from me. And what you do is you shake out your basil, you wet it down, gently washing it to make sure that you've got dirt out of it and bugs, which love basil. Then, you know, the thing I'm going to do too is, this is not going to be that easy to do, but I'm going to try it. I'm squishing it down a bit. And what I'm going to do is weigh this. So here's my colander. I've got half a pound. Yeah. Half a pound on the stem. All right, that's important, on the stem. So now what I'm going to do, it's been washed, gently dried, and now what I'm going to do is something that's going to, I think it's always kind of fun to watch. So you saw, it's a big cluster of herbs. And right now what I'm going to do is going to pull the leaves off of the herbs, and I'm just going to get rid of the big stems. I don't want the big heavy stems. So right now, oh, this smells so good. This is cilantro, and I'm pulling the leaves off of the big stems. Okay, because I'm going to make this a mix of cilantro and basil. you can just use one herb. You can use just parsley. You can use just cilantro, just basil, or combo. Now, if I was cooking with this right now, I would definitely use the stems. Stems have a great flavor, but I'm making a paste. So I'm just trying to get rid of the bigger stems for this, because this is going to have to live in a jar. All right, now the basil leaves. I definitely want to get rid of those big stems because they would be tough in this particular condiment. Any of you growing herbs in your gardens or have access to fresh herbs? What herbs, what green herbs do you like to use?
Oh, basil, cilantro, thyme.
I love thyme.
Basil and cilantro growing on my deck, but also
All right.
have access to herbs through the CSA.
Ah, nice.
Someone
Very
else
nice.
says my basil doesn't look as good as yours.
Well, these guys are particularly large right now. And there's so many different kinds of basil.
Someone else, marjoram and rosemary and dill.
Lots of good stuff. You know, it's interesting. Dill is one herb that I really have not used much. I've used it in herb butters. Yeah, the basil in my garden was really slow getting off the ground, but now it seems to have found its own. And I'm beginning to think that this is, given the size of the leaf, look at the size of this leaf. I'm beginning to think this is a lettuce leaf basil. Look at this bowl. This is a big bowl, and it's filled to the top with basil. What I'm going to do now, and again, this was ½ a pound, and on your recipe sheet, you've got it, it's on the 3rd page. You've got whole leaf basil paste. You've got 1/4 teaspoon of sea salt for every 4 ounces. So I've got 8 ounces. So we're going to be using ½ a teaspoon of sea salt. And one of the things I'm going to do before I get that in there is just take the biggest leaves and cut them up a little bit. Tear them. I'm just tearing them. Okay, so you saw that was a really big bowl. And again, should you come across anything that seems insect bitten or browned in any way, just toss it out. You're going through the trouble of making this. Why not do it with veggies that are whole? All right, so we're using ½ a teaspoon. This is a 1/4 teaspoon measure. Okay. Now, as in your instructions, it says, massage these. Hold them together and start to massage them with your hands. You're working that salt into the leaves. And it's amazing. Oh, it's so fragrant. Holy cow. How this is now already beginning to wilt dramatically in the bowl. Man, This is like amazing. And you want to do this, I'm a little shy. You want to do this for about 3 to 5 minutes. Not very long. Just taking out a big stem. But you are going to be amazed at how this activity, this massaging with your hands, because you want to get that salt into every leaf. And as you saw, those were big leaves. Excuse me, these are mature plants. Oh my gosh. I wish I had had somebody time me. It would have been good to know exactly how much time this has taken. We're almost done. I'm just going to show you how this has been reduced in volume. That big bowl of leaves is now this. It's just sitting at the bottom. That's it. I'll lift it with my hand. That's it. All of those leaves fit now in my hand. So when it comes to jarring this, what should we put it into? You know, when I saw that initial big pile of leaves, I would have thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to need a quart jar. Not at all. This, in fact, will fit very nicely in a 1 cup jar. And I don't have a 1 cup right now in front of me, so what I'm going to do is take this 2 cup jar, and you're going to see just how much of this jar it fills. Okay, so I'm putting some in. And then I'm going to take my cabbage pounder and pound it in. I'll take another bit, put it in the jar, pound it in. It is amazing the volume that has been, the amount of reduction in volume. Okay, so I'm going to do something here. Remember that video that you saw? Here's that same activity where you can see the liquid coming up the sides. Now this pounder that I have here that I'm using, oh, I got this, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago at a garage sale. I mean, they were giving them away. You can find them. Oh my gosh, look at all that brine. All right, so now what do? Of course, it would have been better if this had been in a cup jar, because you want to reduce the opportunity for oxygen and air to get to your ferment, always. Today's purpose, this jar is going to let you see what I'm going to do to reduce that opportunity for air. So here we have the ferment. And again, fermentation starts the moment you add the salt. This is already going. This is already going. And what I'm going to do now is put the follower. Remember, the follower goes on top. So I'm just taking a piece of wax paper. What I'm going to do is stick it down in the jar so that it is covering the surface of the paste. It's not very elegant looking, is it? But this is an old process that people have been using for hundreds of years. And it's a process anyone can do in any home, and is much, well, let's see, I wouldn't say it's much safer, but there have been almost no incidences of food poisoning ever from fermented foods. Yes, from canning, because botulism is the thing that gets you there if you don't can things perfectly well, but not from fermentation. All right, so I've got that. All of the herb is underneath the wax paper, and now I've got to keep it in this kind of environment where there's little air. How do I do that? Well, I add a weight. And they sell all kinds of weights to use in fermentation. Some are glass, some are ceramic, some are plastic. This happens to be a glass disc. And it doesn't really fit well in this jar. This one does. It's a bigger, fatter disc. This one doesn't fit in this jar either. So what I'm going to do, they'll work better in the wide mouth jars. I'm going to take another thing that I've done, which is, you know, those cottage cheese containers that you buy at the store? Some have cottage cheese, some have yogurt, other kinds of vegetables, sour cream. I just cut out a disc and then made a slit in the disc. And I'm going to use that to press down, because this is food grade. Remember those cottage cheese boxes, containers are food grade? I'm going to use it to press down on this ferment. So how am I going to keep this down? What am I going to use it as a way of a weight? Well, another thing that you can do is actually, and what I have used in the past, is I've actually collected rocks, cleaned them, and then boiled them for 20 minutes so that they can be sterile enough to use in my fermentation jar. The other thing that you can do is actually, I'm going to take this out of here. Just use the follower that I had with the wax paper. You take a quart plastic bag. You put some salt, about a teaspoon of salt in it. Then you put this bag in the jar, not full of anything. You put it in the jar, you stick it down in there. Excuse me. Then you fill, once the bag is in there, and it's sitting down at the bottom on top of the ferment, you fill it with water. And that acts as your weight to hold your fermentation under liquid, under its own brine.
Sylvia, we did get one question about how the taste might differ from frozen basil. I'd say she wonders about comparing the two product outcomes, like frozen basil versus the fresh stuff you're using. What would the outcome be like?
All right, well, one, I've never tried freezing basil, so I'm not going to be very good at making a comparison, but I can tell you about this particular process, which is, this is going to sit now for 5 days. Because of the salt that's been added and the anaerobic kind of condition that we've now got it in, it's going to be on that first stage of fermentation. So you're going to have a different flavor than of the plain frozen basil. So it's this is a product that's already begun through the fermentation process. It could no longer be considered fresh basil, but rather a fermented product. So that's something I can tell you about this. And one of the things I guess I do as a final step to any fermentation effort is that I take here we go. I take a piece of masking tape I write down what this thing is. And the date. And I put this on the jar so that I don't forget what I've got going. Because right now I've got a bunch of ferments and stuff going on in my kitchen, and I will not forget.
So what's the fermented basil used for, Sylvia?
The fermented basil is used as a condiment. So this is not something that you'd necessarily eat out of a jar or mean to use as a main salad, but rather you could use it, let's say if you're serving hot rice, this could be something that could be, put a little bit on there. If you've got fish, this could be a condiment, a spice alongside of that. So wherever you're using, you might also use it even in cooking. So if you're making a spaghetti sauce, or you're making a very hearty soup, you'd add a little bit. And again, you try it out a little bit at a time and use that. One of the interesting things about this ferment, this whole leaf condiment, is that it only takes 5 days or so to make, but you can store it in your fridge for months. So this is kind of contradicting almost many of the things that we talked about, but that's how it works. Has anybody here ever made a fermented mustard? That's something I do all the time now, every year. You take your yellow mustard seed, your brown mustard seed, you put them in a blender, let's say a cup each, and you add a little bit of water so that you can create a paste in the blender, but then you add a starter, a culture. You might add whey, which is the liquid that comes off of yogurt. You can add kombucha, which is the way I go. And you add enough liquid, doesn't have to be all kombucha, it could be water. And you add some salt. You add, and I think I add pepper, but it's very little. And you take it through your blender so that it doesn't become a uniform paste, but you get a coarse mustard. And it's a fermented mustard. You take it out of the blender, you put it in a jar, and you let it ferment on your counter for 4 to 5 days. Once that's done, that fermented coarse mustard can sit in your refrigerator for up to a year. And it is just delicious and good for you. And good for you. Now we've come to the end of our time almost, but I had wanted to show you that the radishes have been sitting for 20 minutes. They have produced, and you tell me, Mike, if this is visible. Is this little bowl visible?
Only the one in your hand is.
Okay, so I'll pull this closer to me.
There you go.
Now can you see there? All right. So this is the radish that was just sitting in salt. No water was added, and yet here's all the liquid that's been exuded. That's just the liquid that was sitting at the bottom. Now the next step of this radish, and you've got the recipe in front of you, we can look at it together. is to rinse off the radishes, let them drain, and then combine them with a seasoning paste that includes fresh pepper flakes, some water, grated ginger, clove of garlic that's been minced. Actually, I like to use a garlic press so that I get as fine a mesh as possible out of it. A little bit of sugar. You mix that up, you put it into your jar, and within a day, you've got something to eat. So because of time issues here, I'll show you the finished product. Hold on. So here's my jar, and it's a little cup jar of finished French breakfast radish kimchi. It only needs to sit for a day. Ooh, that's good. Okay, taking out a plate so that I can pull these out and we can see it. This is ready in a day, and something that would be welcome in any picnic. This would be, again, it's a salad, it's a ferment, so you're not necessarily serving like huge mounds of it. You don't usually with ferments. It's not usually huge mounds of it. This would go alongside some hot rice. I love it on hamburgers. I use a lot of ferments actually when I make grilled cheese sandwiches. Wow. So having sat for a day, it has fermented a little bit, but again, just that first stage. It will go now into the fridge, and it needs to be consumed in 3 to 4 days. Ooh. Wow. You know what's surprising me about this? It's surprisingly perfumey, which is nothing I expected. And these are radishes right out in the garden. You know what? One of the things that I think is really comforting about these recipes, again, as I mentioned before, is that you can choose to cut them in a half or a third or a quarter because they need to be consumed quickly. And if there are not a lot of people around to consume it, you don't want to be wasting things. So that's why it's about, you know, picking those little young vegetables, using those small leftovers in your CSA box, the garden thinnings that you come across as you're going through your garden. Because you can make use of those small bits in order to create an interesting salad. This is tonight is going to be going accompanying some freshly made rice. I make organic brown rice. So this will go with it. It's really good. It's really good. Are there any other questions? Yeah.
There's a question about, do you always drain the brine off prior to storing it in the refrigerator?
No. The brine always stays with the kimchi or with that ferment. You never drain it. I just showed how much liquid had been exuded, but that is not going to be thrown out. That will be put into the jar, those radishes, along with the seasoning paste, and that is really critical. You never drain off the brine in a ferment because you want to continually keep it under water, under liquid as much as possible. So let's say I make cabbage kimchi. I make butternut squash and kale kimchi by the quart, and sometimes by the half gallon. As I use up that kimchi, as I consume it, of course, there's more and more space in the jar, so I move it to a smaller jar. so that we're always working, we're always trying to keep the amount of air that product is exposed to, we're always trying to minimize that. And so that liquid serves a very good purpose, even in the fridge. Because although you're not getting the active fermentation that you would on a kitchen counter where it's 72 degrees, there is still preservation that needs to happen even in the fridge. Because as with all fermented foods, they have a definite life. They do not go on forever. And so you want to preserve it as much as you can. Go through the 3 stages if you're going to be doing long-term storage. And keeping things under that, submerged under the liquid, the brine, as much as possible. And again, when it comes to these kinds of fermentations, we're talking about lactic acid fermentation that's activated by salt. We are not talking about vinegar. That's a whole different thing. Were there any other questions? This has been so much fun. I've got lots more to make as I've pulled it from the garden.
Any other questions?
Yeah, and I'd love to hear from you. If you have any other questions, you'll have my email address. And hopefully you can share that, Mike, as you get back to people with the slideshow. And if you've got any kind of follow-up questions or want to share with me your successes, or I'd love to hear from you going forward.
Thank you, Sylvia. And Dorothy does ask, what sea salt do you use? Do you have recommendations about that?
You know, I just looked, I don't have any specific brand that I go after. I do try to buy my sea salt at a food co-op or a natural food store. They're trying to find things that just don't have additives in it. Being careful about that.
Okay, thank you. People are sending their thanks in, and I want to thank you too, Sylvia. And just a quick note to all of you, I'll send a link out probably tomorrow to the video of the class if you want to review anything. I'll also include, once I get it, the PowerPoint from Sylvia and her email address as well. And then just a note about upcoming classes. We've got one next week on making an herbal skin salve from the common plantain, which many of you can probably get out in your yards. So an herbal skin salve, building soil health. One of the reasons Farm Table was founded was a inspiration to a recognition of the importance of soil health. So we'll be having a class on composting and soil health. And then later in August, a gazpacho and fresh bed, you know, that famous tomato-based cold soup. So lots of upcoming classes as well to enjoy. And our restaurant is open for, you know, socially distanced dining and takeout and so on. We are taking the COVID-19 very seriously, and safety is very important. So, but you can go to the restaurant as well. So thank you all for joining us, and do feel free to be in touch with me. You have my email, and then also with Sylvia once you get that.
Great. Well, thanks everyone. Have a good evening. It was fun being with you.
Thank you all. Good night.
Good night.